So I want to thank the people of the Indigo Shire for inviting me to this National Science Week event. I've been sent some questions which that you're sent in for me to ask. So I think I've got about 15 questions here, and I'm going to do my best. I don't know the answer to everything, but I'm going to have a go at each of the questions that has come my way, and hopefully some of you that ask these questions are listening to this video now. So the first question I have here is, what role do native insects play in the pollination of native and domestic plants? So this is a really big question, and the answer is that pollination is vital to insect pollination. Let's say, I'll start with animal pollination, is vital to successful reproduction by about 3/4 to 80% of the plant species in our world. So there are plants that don't need animal pollination, like the grasses are probably the most famous example. So most grasses don't need pollinators; their pollen just moves on the wind. And pine trees similarly don't need animal pollinators; their pollen just moves on the wind. And there's a few plants where pollen just moves on water, for example. And there are some plants where pollen doesn't even move at all; they just only pollinate themselves without needing an animal pollinator. So there are a few different ways of reproducing, for plants to reproduce that don't require pollinators. But the truth is that most plants, this sort of 3/4 to 80% number, most of them do need pollinators. And the most important pollinators are insects. And the most important insect pollinators are bees. So the short answer is it's really, really important. And it's important in two quite different ways. So a lot of people are familiar with the idea that, that because pollination is the first step towards producing a seed, if there's the failure of pollination, then maybe the plant wouldn't produce seed. And that's true for many plants. There's quite a lot of plants that produce some seed without pollination, but they produce more with animal pollination. But then there's also this effect that when a seed is produced from pollination, it means that the pollen has moved between two individual plants, two different plants, and that adds genetic variation to the offspring. So if a plant self-pollinates, the offspring is a lot like the mother, because it's the mother's pollen and the mother's egg combining to make this new seed. But when a seed is produced through cross-pollination, because an animal has moved pollen between flowers, then you get a bit more genetic information from a different individual. So the seeds are more variable, and that variability is really important to make sure that plants can continue to adapt to a changing environment. So as our environment changes, we want our plants to produce lots of seeds, but seeds that are not all the same, seeds that are each a bit different. So there's the opportunity for plants to succeed in some environments and then spread. So this genetic variation as an ingredient that allows plants to adapt is one of the really important reasons for pollination that some people don't understand as well as they understand the simpler idea that pollination is about producing seed and fruits. And then the other point I wanted to make is that although there are groups of plants that don't need animal pollinators, like the grasses, and amongst the grasses, of course, are wheat and barley and oats. So there are some grasses that are very commercially important and important to agriculture. But on the other hand, there are a bunch of things that require insect pollination that are really important to us as well. So the eucalyptus trees are all pollinated by animals. That's why they make these big showy flowers, these colourful showy flowers that are full of nectar. So the most important trees across the whole Australian landscape are animal pollinated. Acacia is probably the next most important group of plants in Australia after eucalyptus, and they too are insect pollinated. So it's hard to underestimate how important insect pollination is to wild plants in Australia. And if you then think about what values we have tied up in eucalypts, for example, both commercial values in forestry, but then also the sort of landscape and recreation values, well, then you can see how important pollination really is. So thank you for that question. The next question says, anecdotally, as mosquitoes attack me on warm summer evenings, it feels like their numbers are not diminishing. How vulnerable are insects, and therefore all plants that rely on them for pollination, to the impacts of climate change or bushfire or drought? And what are their survival mechanisms? I'm wondering, are insects in trouble? So that's a great question, and I think that question is probably motivated by some of the reports that you might have read recently about the idea that insects are in decline. So if you Google it or look at some of the newspaper sites, you'll see reference to the insect apocalypse and so on. So there's specific concern about bee decline, and there's other concerns about just decline of all insects. And these concerns about decline partly reflect that we know that a lot of nature is in decline, and so why should insects be any different? So that reflects a general concern, and then it also reflects a few studies that seem to indicate a decline in insects. So in a moment I'll talk about those studies, but first I'll talk about why it might, how to understand this. So the first thing, one of the questions is, how vulnerable are insects? So that's one of the questions put here. And the way to answer that is to recognize that there are at least 1 million different species of insect. So the answer really is, in those 1 million insects, 1 million different species, there are some that are vulnerable, some that are highly vulnerable. There's some that are probably not very vulnerable, like the notorious idea that cockroaches will be the last animals left on Earth, and maybe there's some truth to that idea. So we have vulnerable things, and we have invulnerable things, and we have everything in between. So there's not really like one answer for all insects. The truth is that there are insects going extinct right now. There's insects that have already gone extinct. There's more insects going extinct right now. And then on the other hand, there are some insects that are doing better now than at any other time in history. The insects, for example, that are well adapted to agriculture, to modern agriculture, are more common now than ever before, because agriculture is more common. So there's not one answer, there's winners and there's losers. One thing that helps us guess which ones might be winners and losers is that some insects lead highly specialized lifestyles. So some insects are associated with just one species of plant. You might know, for example, of some butterflies whose caterpillars can only feed on the leaves of one particular species in the environment. So there are lots of insects like that, which we think of as feeding specialists. And those insects are more vulnerable because they're tied inevitably to the life of that plant. So not only might the insect be vulnerable, but the plant might be vulnerable. If that plant disappears, then the insect goes with it. So there are many, in those 1 million species, there are probably hundreds of thousands or more that are these highly specialized insects, which are probably at the vulnerable end. But then at the other end, let's go back to the cockroaches. They might have some habitat specialization, but frankly, cockroaches can eat a really wide range of different things. Basically, if it's brown, rotten stuff lying on the ground, cockroaches can eat it. So they're going to be much more able to adapt to different kinds of environments because they're not highly specific on one particular food type. So it's useful to think about the generalists and the specialists. We do know that extinction rates globally for all life on Earth are bad. They're higher now than they have been at any other time in history, as far as we understand. So that's a terrible fact about the world at the moment. And because we know that's true for life in general, we believe that insects are really not a lot different, even though they're actually probably less well studied in terms of their populations. So we have a less clear picture for when insects might go extinct. But there are species that have gone extinct in recent times, and there are other species that we know are vulnerable. On the other hand, so one of the questions, well, one of the parts of this question was, what are their survival mechanisms? Well, actually, insects have got a few traits that make them pretty great survivors. There's the fact that they lead, they have short life cycles, meaning that they don't have to be alive long before they can reproduce. So some insects can have a generation every month or something like that. Okay, so that means that they can really increase their populations very rapidly because of this rapid reproductive rate. And a lot of insects also can lay lots and lots of eggs or lots and lots of larvae. So whereas humans have one baby at a time, or occasionally 2 or 3, insects sometimes might be able to produce thousands of young at once. So high reproductive potential and a fast reproductive rate combine to make them able to rapidly take advantage of an opportunity if an opportunity comes their way. And then a third ingredient that most but not all insects have is they're highly, highly mobile. Many insects fly, and some of them are really very good flyers. And so that means that they can travel from location to location and quickly occupy places where they can then reproduce rapidly. So in many ways, insects actually have the potential to be really, really great survivors. And there are many species that will continue to be great survivors. But there are other ones that are vulnerable because they depend on such particular food types or locations on Earth. Okay, next question. So this question asks, has there been much research done on wild pollinator insects in Australia? I ask this because we hear a lot about the decline of bees, which is devastating. What about other insects? Is there much data available to know if there are changes? So this question's got a fair bit in common with the question before, and I've talked about this general issue of insect decline. I'll talk more about general insect decline, and then I'll talk about bee decline specifically. The insect decline stories that attract a lot of attention originated with studies in a few different places around the world, including there was one study in Germany and one in Puerto Rico were the two best known ones. And they were locations where researchers happened to have recorded a long-term data set. So in other words, they sampled insect populations over a period of more than a decade. Right, so most research is done within a year or within a couple of years. Most research is short-term because it's quite expensive and difficult to do things over the long term. But every now and then, there's an opportunity for long-term research. And these studies had collected data over a long-term period of time, which allowed them to compare what were insect populations like, for example, 10 years ago to now. You need these long-term data sets if you're going to analyse those trends. And those particular studies in Germany and Puerto Rico and a couple of other places I can't remember did seem to suggest lower insect numbers now than in the past. And that was really what prompted this concern that maybe we have declining insect populations. The problem is that we don't have enough of those kinds of studies. Even those particular studies, the German study and the Puerto Rican study, were not very long-term, and they were not really necessarily designed in the right way to answer these questions. So we're just trying to make do with what data they had. So if you really wanted to know if insects were declining over as a long-term trend, you would need to have widespread sampling, sampling in lots of environments, not just one place or two places, but in many different places. And you need to select those places carefully to make sure there aren't other changes. And then you'd need to collect that data every year or every couple of years at least, and then do it for quite a long time, for 20 or 30 years. And it's just a sad fact of research that we don't have that kind of data. So there are definitely people around the world now trying to set up long-term monitoring so that we have a better idea. In 10 years, we'll be in a better position to say, is there really an insect decline that's global, or is it really just happening in a few places? But until we get that data, we don't know for sure. But there are genuine reasons for us to be concerned about it. And then there's a lot of talk about a bee decline in particular. So not just insects broadly, but bees in particular. And those issues are largely coming from concern about honeybees, because honeybees are used so heavily in agriculture, and agricultural environments can be so difficult for bees because of the use of agricultural chemicals like pesticides and so on. So we know that in some countries, honeybee populations are struggling. It's harder to keep bees alive under modern agriculture than it was under the way we did agriculture in the past. So we know that's a real phenomenon in some places, but we know there's other places in the world that have got more bees now than ever, because beekeepers have been motivated by market forces to spend more time looking after their bees. We do know that there are some bee diseases which are causing declines in honeybees as well, and that's probably the biggest concern in Australia, is that we might get some of these bee diseases. But that's just the honeybee. If you ask the question, what do we know about those 20,000 other species of wild bee, then the answer is we know that some have gone extinct. We don't know what the general trend is yet, for the reason I mentioned before. So the questioner here asks also, what do we know about Australia in particular? So Australia has the same problem that the world has of there not being enough information. It's probably got that problem even worse because there's just not that many people in Australia compared to, say, North America or Europe. So there's fewer researchers to do the work. But we do know, for example, that in the same way that Australia is famous for having a distinctive community of beautiful mammals like koalas and kangaroos and so on, we also have a distinctive community of unique bees. So there's a whole family of bees that's found in Australia that's not found anywhere else in the world. There's another family that's kind of an oddball elsewhere in the world, but in Australia is the most diverse family. So in the same way that Australia is special for its mammals, it's also special for its bees. So we have reason to be concerned that if there's declines in Australia, that matters globally. But there's just not enough monitoring to know. I've done studies, and colleagues of mine have done studies for a few years at a time at a few different places, and we're starting to try and put those together. But we'll need more time to understand if there's a general problem in Australia.